Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have a list of the best books that I read in 2023. Originally I did plan on creating a top 40 like I did at the beginning of last year and whittling it down to a top 10. Indeed, there was a top 12. However, when I looked at the books I'd read last year, 13 of them were from Kate Atkinson because I chose to read her entire volume of work, and about 20 of them were graphic novels, of which I didn't particularly think that they were worthy of being on the best of list, which took us down to 80, which meant that every 1 in 2 would have had to have made it onto the top 40 to actually have one. I will admit that last year there was a definite reduction in quality when it came to what I was reading. You could have had a top 10, which was just Kate Atkinson, because I really did enjoy my time going through her entire work, and it has given me an idea of something that I want to do this year with a few other writers. I have pulled together what I think is the best fiction that I read last year. To begin with, we have Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. I think that this is going to be on a lot of people's lists this year. I read it quite early on as a bit of a buddy read alongside Charlie of Charlie Brook Reads, and at first I have to say that I was not enjoying this book as much as I thought, because I kept likening things to David Copperfield. When I was doing that, I kept thinking, well, this is clearly what's going to happen now because this is what happens in the original text. As soon as I pushed aside the idea that this was just trying to be a retelling of David Copperfield and just immersed myself in this story, I began to enjoy myself more. Therefore, I think that with Demon Copperhead, it's a book that works best if you haven't read David Copperfield before. I think that Kingsolver does what she does incredibly well, which is create a sense of place and a sense of time and a sense of character. Something that I find often happens with Kingsolver's characters is that I forget that they aren't real. I just have this very strong sense of believability when it comes to Kingsolver's work. Having just read Prozac Nation when I went into this book, I had gained this insight into the opioid crisis that I hadn't had. And I don't think you need to have that, but it was definitely something I was glad to have knowledge about when reading this book. It did sometimes feel a bit like tragedy piled upon tragedy, but also, you know, Dickens used to do that too. And I just think that Kingsolver is a phenomenal writer indeed. Next, we have Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, and this is another book that was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. I adored the language within this book and was swept up by it as soon as I started reading. I felt for the characters, even though the protagonist within this tale was doing something which we might consider abhorrent. I couldn't help but feel for her. It was a very tense novel that I sped through, and sometimes I find that if a book is keeping my attention and I can't stand to leave the world in which the author has created, either due to the tension and needing to know what's going to happen or because of the beautiful prose within the tale. There is so much within this one that is to do with language, and that's something that I particularly enjoy to see discussed, and very much appreciated what Kennedy was doing here. I think it talks about the way that the Irish were treated by the English well, but also the way in which certain members of society can get away with things based upon their position in society, and sometimes a person can become deified just because of the way a community sees them, and therefore will allow them to get away with some things that maybe they oughtn't be allowed to. I think it says a little bit about misogyny at the time, and is a book that I would very much like to return to. I think it's one that if you return to, there will be more strands to unpick, and you'll be able to see more beneath the surface than you did on an original read. I should say that these books were in no particular order as I move on to the next one, You Will Never Be Forgotten by Mary South. A volunteer from the charity shop handed me this book and wanted my opinion because she is a big fan of short stories, and she found that this collection was somewhat too modern for her and wondered whether it was just full of gimmicks. Having read this book, I can see where she's coming from. However, the book completely appealed to my sensibilities. Certainly there were times where I was wondering why the author had chosen to craft stories in a certain format. I think that what this book does well is examine grief, which is something that I have discussed last year as well. I like to see grief examined. As somebody who's experienced it a lot, it's a topic that I can sometimes shy away from, but is one that I do like to see explored. And I think that Mary South explores it well within this collection. But something else that I think she explores well is the relationship between humanity and technology, and the advancements that we're making and what that might mean in the future. The word that I want to use to describe the prose in here is clean, and I don't mean that in a derogatory fashion. I just mean it felt understandable, but also almost a pleasure to read, even though there is stuff where you can read between the lines as you can do with most short stories due to the fact that they only have a short amount of time to get across their point. There was just something about the reading that felt easy, and it felt like I was in the hands of somebody who knew what they were doing in terms of craft. Next, we have The Refugees by Viet. Within pages of beginning this short story collection, I had taken a picture of a quote from the first story and sent it to Charlie of Charlie Brook Reads and told her that she ought to read this collection as well. Similar to You Will Never Be Forgotten, tales within here discuss grief. They discuss familial trauma due to the fact that we will see tales that are discussing the Vietnam War. We see tales of love, lost love, and heartbreak. This is a collection that is exceedingly beautiful, hard-hitting, and hugely human. And I say that because we get to see facets of human life in a warts and all type of scenario, family situations that some of us will never be able to properly understand, but through this book we can gain an understanding and an appreciation of the way in which different types of families can work. The prose is something that, as a writer, I envy, because it's one of those books where I look at it, I see a turn of phrase, I see a imagining or a thought that has made its way into words, and I just think that's correct, but I have absolutely no idea how you managed to convey it in such a fashion. Extremely glad of its existence and look forward to revisiting it in future. Then we have Excellent Women by Barbara Pym. This was recommended by the same volunteer who gave me You Will Never Be Forgotten. It was also recommended by Shaun the Book Maniac years ago, and I think that Leo of Leo's Little Book Life had a copy of this one at one point. I have said for years that I was waiting to finish reading Elizabeth Taylor before I moved on to Barbara Pym. She was going to be another project of mine, but considering the volunteer's adoration for Barbara Pym, I decided that I had to pick it up, and I did. And I adored it. Barbara Pym is definitely writing the sort of stories which I wish I could write, and I said this at the time: if you've liked my stories at all, then you will like Barbara Pym. She is doing what I aim to do, and doing it a lot better is all I can say. This is a tale of Mildred Lathbury, who is something of a perpetual spinster, really, is looked on in a certain type of way by the community around her. She gets some new neighbours in the beginning of this book, and it feels like she is being used as a catalyst for the reader to get to experience society from an every woman's point of view. Mildred is a character who you see get maligned and pushed to the sidelines. You can't help but feel for her, really, and it kind of made me rather excited to go and read the rest of Barbara Pym's works. I have another book by the author that the same volunteer found for me when we went to a Christmas party with work, and they had books in the lavatories to purchase, only in the ladies. I suppose that if they put books in the men's lavatories, then I would never read, or you know that some silly old fool would decide to try and flush one. I can't find the quote, but there was something where a room was being decorated a particular colour, and the colour was described in such a fashion that I found it humorous and kept bringing it up to everyone at the time. I also think that Pym's books are great to read to get an idea of society at the time in which she was writing, and the way in which normal people behaved around one another, and that is normal middle-class folk with air quotations above it, indeed. Next we have In Memoriam by Alice Winn. This is a book that Charlie sent me a message saying that she was reading I ought to get, and we got it, and we both started reading it at the same time. We both finished reading it on the same Sunday because it was such a compulsive read that we threw out all other plans we had to just sit and get this one read. I can remember sitting at the living room window and just speeding through this. It is a tale of love between two gay men who end up fighting in the First World War. I know that certain people who know more about the history of the time took umbrage with this book. I read this book alongside Fighting Proud, which was a tale of gay men who fought in the First and Second World Wars. So I wasn't finding it too unbelievable at the time, but I'm no historian. I enjoyed this tale. I thought that it was written beautifully. I thought that Alice Winn had crafted a fantastic tale of love through turbulent times, not least because of the way in which homosexuality was viewed in society at the time. I think that there was a fantastic allegory and characterisation and description within this novel, and I meant to buy myself a copy when I went uptown before Christmas. I was going to get myself a copy and a copy for a friend for her Christmas present, and I couldn't find a copy at the bookshop, and it was only as I was leaving that I found the huge stack by the door, but they were facing but you couldn't see them as you came in, you could only see them as you were leaving, and at that point I was in such a rush that I just had to leave them. Either way, it's a book that I look forward to owning one day in the future, and I'm so pleased that other people have found this book and adored it just as much as I have, if not more. Next we have The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, which is the first book in the Wheel of Time series, and this book had to be on here. I wasn't going to get this book out of the library, but part of me had this hankering for a traditional old school fantasy, and I saw it at the library, decided to read it, took it home, and I read this entire book in a week. It was a book in which I'd read that the author chose to keep the story very close to Lord of the Rings in the first half, so that people would feel like they knew the setting. But then at the page 300 or something mark, it veers off in a completely different direction. And when this book did that, I began to notice things that I've seen in later fantasy novels, and I'm wondering whether they were inspired by Robert Jordan. I could not avoid putting this book on this list because it was one of those books that I sped through, regardless of the size of it. And I am currently reading the second one, and the second one has done something a little bit similar. I had to put that aside for other reasons. I've become scared in the second book of bad things happening to a character that I've only known for a page. That is how well Robert Jordan I have found has been able to craft characters. And this is going to be an investment because I believe that there are 14 books in this series, but I do look forward to it. It feels weird to say, but it just feels like a comfortable fiction to settle into, regardless of the terrible things happening. And I mean, like in this first book, I did not expect for it to go in directions it's gone in the first 200 pages of the second book. The second book has some terrible things happening to entire villages, and I have found myself in shock. Then we have Thrust by Lidia Yuknavitch. So this is one where I started reading it and Charlie started reading it because we saw the cover for this last year and decided we had to own it. I ended up liking what I was reading. Charlie ended up not liking the experience and DNFing the read. This is a book where you have to throw every single expectation you've ever had about time out of the window, because in this tale, science and time do not exist. People can imagine that they are inside whales, as in Whales, due to something that they've read in a Bible, and then they will end up inside that whale and it will provide them with some sort of sanctuary. Like I say, time and science don't exist because sometimes an older version of the main character, Liv as both a younger character and an older character, can go back and forth in time. She's doing this to save certain people. There really is a sense of chaos within the narrative from that, due to the fact that, as I say, time is formless and this character moves through it as though it's water. So you can see her as a young woman in the 1800s. You can then see her again as a young woman in 200 years in the future, and then you can see her as an older woman 300 years in the past, because it just doesn't exist. It's a bit mind-boggling, but it was just the sort of weird that I liked and ended up setting me up to go and buy more weird books in the latter half of the year. Naturally, I haven't read any of them, but that happened. Then we have The Secrets of Hartwood Hall by Booktube's Katie Lumsden. You will know her as Katie of Books and Things. And Charlie and I hosted a read-along of this book back in September, for Secret September. I know from past experiences that Katie is a fan of the author Diane Setterfield. And so I was looking forward to this book. And it gave me just what I want from Gothic literature as written by Diane Setterfield. Katie is a fantastic writer, and within this book what we see is an adoration for Victorian literature through the prose, metatextual experiences. It is a tale of Victorian England that possibly had to wait until now to be told. It is almost like a sensation novel. It is atmospheric. Margaret Lennox becomes a governess at Hartwood Hall, and you are aware that she is hiding secrets. I will say there were times when books would be mentioned that Margaret was reading, and I would think that they were foreshadowing things to come. I would message Charlie asking her whether she thought this was foreshadowing to something, only for Charlie to say she hadn't read that book, which just left me all on my own at sea trying to see. And I have to say, I was thrilled that that had happened. I was thrilled by the intertextuality of it all. I was thrilled by the hearkening towards other Victorian novels, well, not other Victorian novels, classic Victorian novels that might have inspired this text. It was such a thrilling read, and I think that all of us coming together and reading this book really helps to enhance the experience of reading this novel and events that were happening within the tale. And, you know, I don't think I've ever despised a character as much as I've despised Susan within this book. That's all I'll say. Just that Katie really knows how to write a good villain. And finally, we have Behind the Scenes at the Museum by Kate Atkinson. Story behind this book. When I was in sixth form, a friend of mine said that this was her favourite novel. I subsequently purchased it from a charity shop and never read it. I tried reading the first page, and back then I used to have a really big thing against reading something in first person. Nowadays I find it something incredibly easy to get into, but for whatever reason back then there was just something I found difficult about reading first person. Anyway, that aside, I have since gone on to read more Kate Atkinson, and didn't get around to behind the scenes at the museum. And then in 2023, having reread Emotionally Weird, which up until last year was my favourite Kate Atkinson of the 3 that I had read, I decided that I wanted to go back and reread every single one of Kate Atkinson's works. And so if you followed my journey at the start of the year on this channel, you'll see all the ones that I read. I stopped at Case Histories and then went back a few months later, and this was actually the penultimate Kate Atkinson that I read. And this was her first ever novel. I finally read it, and I finally understand why it was my friend's favourite book. This is a book in which we follow, I'm sure it's Ruby. Yes. And that's intriguing to me. I was just finding it funny because The Secrets of Hartwood Hall follows Margaret Lennox, and Behind the Scenes at the Museum follows Ruby Lennox. And in here, Ruby is cataloguing the history of her family. At times we'll veer off and we'll hear stories of her ancestors. I found Behind the Scenes at the Museum humorous. It told us about England in the 20th century, and again, this is a non-linear storyline, so it goes back and forth and you get to see all of the ways in which certain events that we know have happened actually came about. I thought that it was a great way to also see how characters we might have seen cast as villains at certain points in the story actually came to make decisions that saw them cast in that light. And Kate Atkinson can just be such a funny author. What I found that I appreciated was the interior way in which she tells stories. You feel like you're very close to the characters at all times. And over the last year of reading her works, I picked one because I never like to include multiples within top 10s, but this could have easily been any number of the books of this author's that I read last year, because I think that she just manages to craft characters in such a way that you can't help but feel emotionally connected to them. There have been times, I only finished this book about 2 months ago, if that, and I've already been considering rereading it now that I own my own copy. I don't know how to explain it other than, of all the Kate Atkinsons I read, I did feel most attached to Behind the Scenes at the Museum. I'm not saying that it's the best written. Indeed, there's something that happens towards the end that I felt came out of left field and soiled my experience reading it, but also part of me likes the fact that this isn't an entirely perfect novel. As I say, I think that there are some books that she wrote later that might actually be told better and feel like she finally achieved what she'd been setting out to do all these years before. But there's just something nice and messy about her early work where she is unafraid to make certain jokes. I would probably say that this is definitely maybe the book of the year for me. I know that I say I don't rank these books, but if I was going to choose any as a favourite of last year, then it would be Behind the Scenes at the Museum, I think. It's definitely, if not that, Kate Atkinson, it was definitely the year of this author, maybe even surpassed some of my favourites. And them's the books. If you've read any of these books and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. What were some of your favourite reads of last year? Let's get a discussion going. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.